Well, thank you all and good morning. Great honor to be the lead-off speaker. Just take 1 minute to also express my thanks to all of you here at Aspetar for including us in your wonderful organization. And I would be remiss if I didn't start by reminding all of you, and all of you in the other room there, what a fantastic opportunity you have here. So I hope that you get up every morning as charged up about coming in here to do sport medicine as I do when I get on that plane to come over here and rejoin you. It's absolutely wonderful. It's marvelous, and had a great time working with Vasily. I know Vasily's in the audience somewhere. All right, without further ado, ethical decisions in return to play. I have no conflicts of interest. Couple of quick goals, hopefully understand a couple of ethical issues, working with the adolescent athletes with either a life-altering or a life-threatening condition. Be able to really determine the relevant parties that are involved, because I think any ethical decision that we make is never made in a vacuum. You need to involve multiple people. And then develop a strategy for how you might deal with this. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is to stay open-minded, because the paradigms that we will be applying to our athletes can change and can shift. And so what I've decided to do is to share a couple of cases that I've had to work my way through over the years. And the first case I'm going to talk about is a wrestler with one eye, and I have a very small case series of actually 2 cases at my university. And I'll start out with the recommendations initially for this were that a lack of reliable eye protection devices makes protection impossible, thus wrestling is not recommended. And this was through a Prescribing for College Sports article by Vinger. Recommendations made by various organizations in my country, the American Academy of Family Physicians, they were very bald-faced about this and said they should never participate in wrestling because of the danger. Eye protection is not one of those sports. A PPE monograph that I was actually in the writing group for, and stay tuned because in November the 5th edition is going to come out. We're going to begin to work on the 5th edition of this. A little looser, qualified, yes, for a functionally one-eyed athlete. American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of American Academy of Ophthalmology had a joint policy statement about 10 years ago that, again, a little less stringent, but still not recommending it, and ultimately said the wrestler has a custom-made eye protection must be made aware that it's insufficient to prevent injury. So functionally one-eyed, it's very high risk. So my first case, 19-year-old kid, big, strong, tough kid, and he had his physical done by his hometown doc, and there was absolutely no mention made of the fact that he was functionally one-eyed. He was only sighted in one eye. He was seen in the training room for something entirely different. He had a musculoskeletal injury, and it became clear as we were examining him that he had difficulty with his binocular vision, and turned out that he had light perception only in one eye. He's otherwise perfectly healthy kid. So we were concerned. The recommendations were probably don't let this kid play, and we made a decision after consultation with his coach, the athletic trainer, myself, that we didn't think he should wrestle. He should probably encourage him to an alternative sport. This is a Division III university. None of our kids are going on to have any kind of a professional or elite career. But he was absolutely adamant. He said he wrestled through high school and he did just fine, and if we didn't let him wrestle, he was going to sue us. So our strategy at that time was to communicate with him, his parents, keep him apprised of what we were doing, and then canvass others. And I canvassed people literally around the country. I talked to other sports physicians. I talked to coaches. I talked to people who had worked through this before. I engaged our athletic administration, the student health services, and our legal team at the university as well because of the threatened lawsuit. So nationwide, opinions varied. There was no consistency in opinion, and we ultimately, after consultation with our athletic director, pictured for you here, our head athletic trainer, etc., made the decision not to play. Our legal team supported us. So the outcome, he didn't play, he didn't lose his sight, he did not sue us, and he left school. And so was that really the best outcome? Did we serve that young man's needs despite all of the people that we had on board for that decision? So now fast forward a few years, and I've got a second case. Again, a 19-year-old kid at his pre-pars comes in. At this time, we identified him early on and ultimately reached the same decision. We'd already been there once before. We had the same team in place. The exact same folks were participating, and we simply went the easy route of making that same decision. However, there's more. We now had a new coach, and we had a new athletic trainer, and that athletic trainer was pictured for you in the lower right-hand corner. And his name was Shinbo, and I learned a lot from this young man. He advocated for his athlete. He went back and did a nationwide search, and he came up with a number of people who had not only wrestled successfully, but at a very high level with goggles, and despite the risk of injury, realized that some rules had shifted, although not completely changed, and we opted to try some goggles. There were problems with these goggles, frequent cuts. Opponents were attacking that kid's eye because they knew he only had one eye, and we had really concerns about this. So, but we went back, and because other people around the country had now, the tide had begun to change, we decided to allow him to wrestle, although we continued to encourage him to engage in track because he also threw the shot put. And ultimately, with his parents and with his kids, he decided on his own not to wrestle, to participate in track, and he stayed in school and then graduated 4 years later. So in that case, a much different outcome, a better outcome, I think. And what I learned from this was listen to others. Mores and ethics change. Decisions can change and shift. So keep your eye on, and I use that deliberately, that was a bad joke, I'm sorry. But keep your eye on the goal here, which is education for this young man. So the next case I'm going to share with you is long QT, and most of you probably recognize long QT as a potentially fatal arrhythmia that occurs, and it's a genetic abnormality. And this is a young man who presented to me as a freshman at the high school. I take care of I've been a team doc and a school doc for a high school for over 20 years now. And this is a young man who was perfectly healthy, but he had a twin sister who had exercise-related syncope. And during that workup, she was diagnosed with long QT. And then when we tested him, he had a borderline abnormal EKG. His echocardiogram was normal. His stress testing was normal, but his genetic testing was long QT S1 type. And that is a potentially fatal variant. It's a dangerous variant. Now, this young man wanted to participate in football, basketball, and lacrosse. It turns out with further history that he had an uncle who died of long QT. His father tested positive for long QT, and there were other second-degree relatives who also tested positive for long QT. Again, we had that stress test with the echo. Everything seemed okay with him. But as you may or may not know, that long QT can exhibit, as the athlete gets a bit older, the phenotype becomes expressed. And you don't know when that's going to happen. He went to see a local cardiologist who cited the European guidelines and the Bethesda guidelines. He said no participation, no play, and we were pretty comfortable with that. Then this family, who's a very wealthy family, very prominent parents, his father was the CEO of one of the larger corporations in Maine, and I won't tell you what corporation that is, but they sell a lot of boots, if you catch my drift. Anyway, they went to a Boston cardiologist who cited a cardiologist in Mayo named Ackerman, and he cleared him to play as long as the team physician, me, could provide a quote-unquote safe environment. I wasn't sure what that meant. So the family petitions the school, which ultimately came to me, and I hit the books, went online, tried to search for the best evidence. There was no best evidence. I talked with cardiologists around the country, and in fact the world. I talked with some of our colleagues in Italy, and then I consulted with Dr. Ackerman at Mayo. Big meeting, parents, lawyers, administrators, myself, coaches, and note that the athlete wasn't there, which I found a little interesting. So at this point, anybody here let this kid play? 3-sport athlete, he's 15, potentially lethal. Anybody? Nico. Okay, you can come up, Nico. Give the rest of the talk. Yeah. All right. So just a quick thing on guidelines. There are a lot of guidelines, and the guidelines that we generally follow in the United States are the Bethesda guidelines, and this is number 36 if you're keeping score and you want to look it up. And then there's the European Society of Cardiology, which has another set of guidelines, also as well structured as they can be. And if someone is an asymptomatic genotype, positive, phenotype negative, with a borderline QT, which defines this young man, the Europeans would discourage sport. The Bethesda would say, well, maybe there's no restrictions except long QT S1, which, oh yeah, our kids got S1. And then swimming, for reasons that are a little obscure, is a higher risk sport. So the evidence on this, well, there really is none. It's all opinion. And the opinion was that use of drugs like beta blockers in athletes can't be regarded as affording a protection against this, and it's not a means for attaining eligibility in competitive sports. And secondarily, and I want you to remember the second point too, the availability of an AED should not be considered protection or justification for participating in a competitive sport that otherwise would be restricted because of the, oh yes, life-threatening arrhythmia. So here I am sitting wondering, okay, exactly what would be a safe environment for this young man? So if you go back and look at Ackerman, the only evidence really on this is from Ackerman. Again, this guy at Mayo has a huge experience with long QT, and I won't go through this in detail, but basically what he concluded was that athletes' families can self-select, and the current guidelines were too restrictive. And he really came down in the favor of family and athlete autonomy to make an informed decision about continuing athletics. So he would do a very extensive workup, much of what we'd already done. We had not done the 24-hour monitor. We'd done everything else, including the psychological consultation. And then he said, okay, as long as you've gone through all that, if you have him on a beta blocker, I'm good. Treat him with a beta blocker, have an AED handy always. He considered that a safe environment. So now you got to make sure that kid's going to take his beta blocker. Now Policia and his colleagues in Italy, the rebuttal to that was, well, what about these folks who have some prolonged QT? And Ackerman was really only looking at the folks who were phenotype negative. He said that ethically he would not allow play. So I've still got conflicting evidence. So the decision that we made was that our safe environment was that he took Nadolol. His parents said that they would monitor that. We had an AED on the sidelines at all times. We made sure it was all charged up. We had to educate everybody, including his teammates, on the use of the AED. We had to get buy-in from all of his coaches. We had to educate everybody on what this meant. And we had, importantly, to talk to his teammates about what they would do if this kid had sudden cardiac death while he was next to them on the field of play. So we had a lot of meetings with the teams and the kids and the parent groups, and ultimately everybody said, no, we want him to play. And so he's now in his senior year. He's a starter on 3 varsity teams. And his team doctor is holding his breath, waiting for him to graduate so that he will become someone else's ethical dilemma. Thank you.